Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trade and Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
John, how are you doing?
Sam, I'm doing absolutely wonderful. It's a beautiful day here in central Alabama. However, I know there are a bunch of people up in New York and elsewhere that might not be doing quite as well here today.
The focus on Ivy League schools has seemingly grown significantly over the last 12 months, really, and not for the right reasons.
Well, not for the right reasons, or better put, maybe not for the right reasons for a majority of Americans. You know, we had the three university presidents, at the end of last year, get up there in front of Congress and kind of waffle on some things, and really does kind of surround anti-Semitism and what have you, and really all this started with the Hamas invading, for lack of a better term, southern Israel back on October 7th, and things just seem to have spiraled completely out of control since then, and just finding out maybe just how anti-Semitic a huge chunk of, well, if not the entire Northeast, at least the Northeast educational establishment is.
Yeah, and it seems like we've trended this direction where the focus on Ivy Leagues or the importance of Ivy Leagues has maybe been diminishing slowly for a little while, or at least it's felt that way. And then this, I think, has really kind of ramped it up. And I think that's something, you know, a lot of the topics we've talked about lately are small trends that are happening at a time during a greater trend of that already happening. Yeah. And this kind of feels maybe like that same kind of scenario where it's, again, maybe this focus on the most expensive education is starting to tail, and then some of these Ivy League schools are really putting a lot of people off at the same time. Well,
I would agree with you on that, and I will have to tell you that when you take a look really sort of at global rankings for the 8 schools in the Ivy League, there's a huge sort of divergence in a lot of ways, from the top ones down to the ones that you could, well, I guess you'd have to say the bottom ones. Took a look at recent surveys from various groups around the world, not necessarily those based in the United States. I do think that there is some location bias to some of these surveys. But the Times out of the United Kingdom recently put together one, and not surprisingly, I think Oxford and Cambridge are up there near the top. Harvard was up there, I think, maybe at number 4, and Yale was also in the top 10, as was Princeton. Then Pennsylvania was maybe 14. Cornell was 20th out of total global universities. Then all of a sudden you start seeing, well, Brown at 64, and I think Dartmouth made it in at 164 and what have you. And those types of numbers, particularly for Brown and Dartmouth, were numbers that I never would have thought feasible not so long ago. But even more important than that, I think you kind of hit on it, is the general public perceptions of the Ivy Leagues, and sort of by guilt by association, the entire sort of Northeast educational establishment, if you don't mind me going there. And, you know, for long years, I mean, really my entire life, and prior to that, that was really sort of the creme de la creme, if you will. I mean, getting into an elite Northeastern university, Ivy League's great. Williams, Amherst, Tufts, a whole bunch of Wesleyan, a whole bunch of other ones are up there that are well thought of. And that was really kind of your key to success, because it suggested not only that you were a top student, but then also that you were pretty well connected. Yep. So getting into one of these schools, you can go in there and come out with a C. C equals dollar signs and all that stuff. People that you know, all of a sudden you can set yourself up.
Yeah, people may not like my opinion on this, but I think the main takeaways, if you had an Ivy League degree or a top of the Ivy League degree, was one, that you were smart enough to get in, most likely. Yeah. Not really the education you got there. It's probably a great education, but it was more the smart enough to get in, and then the connections that you made after it, or during it, for after it. Those, to me, were the two big selling points of a top of the top school Ivy League degree.
Well, I will tell you, you hit on something there. It's not necessarily the education that you get at those places. I don't mind telling you this. You can get a great education at just about any institution of higher learning.
It's what you put into it.
It's what you put into it. And the professors at some of these so-called, or I hate saying lesser institutions, will love you if all of a sudden you're as engaged as maybe someone that goes to Harvard or what have you. Just engaged, and you can learn a ton. And I like to say, and I don't like to say it, but, you know, I went to Wake Forest University, which is not anywhere in the global rankings, but considered a reasonably decent school by reputation for undergraduate. And I went to the University of Baltimore to get an MBA at night. And University of Baltimore is a tertiary school, probably at best. I learned more, actually, at the University of Baltimore, more that was applicable in my daily life than I did in the 4 years at Wake Forest.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, college is that first time where you get your own kind of free will.
I mean, listen, I learned how to play AC-doocy, also known as high-low, spades, a number of different things, drank a lot of beer. I didn't do any of that. And then really, a lot of that was on me. It wasn't on the school.
Yeah.
I was far more willing to learn, I guess you could say, at the University of Baltimore. Now, I learned a lot.
Yeah, I learned that college teachers tend to be very passionate about what they're teaching, and if you're willing to put in a lot, they're willing to give back a lot.
Yes, without a doubt.
That's not going to be everybody, but again, so going back to, I think the main point of all this is, I'm sure the education's great. Obviously, some of the best teachers in the world teach at those schools, but at the end of the day, it's less about that, more about, one, hey, this person was clearly incredibly smart to get into Harvard, to get into Yale, and secondly, the alumni network there is, I think, the powerhouse of those schools. Well,
I think you're right, and now let's get kind of like veering into the meat of the matter here today is sort of what's happened to the Ivy League's reputations, really primarily over the last 12 months, but you kind of alluded to as sort of a slippery slope to where they are now. And I got to tell you, a huge chunk of it, in my estimation, is perhaps the fact they've become so prestigious that they are now viewed as even more elitist and just out of touch with the common person. That when all this stuff kind of fell apart over the last 12 months, it really didn't come as a surprise to anyone. I remember as a kid, the Yale-Harvard game was actually broadcast on ABC or CBS, whoever had the game. Now it's you have to find it, that type of deal. So in the public perception, Yale and Harvard and Ivy League were kind of up there in terms of, sort of national visibility. These are what you aspire to be. These are the best of America, all that type of stuff. Now it's we all know they're good schools, but there's so many other fish to fry. There's so many other good schools. There's so many other places where you can learn that have good networks and what have you. That's not to take away from the Northeastern schools, and anyone that's up there and went to one is probably getting ready to give us a very bad review on our podcast. I'm just telling you what the common person in the Deep South is sort of feels about the Northeastern schools right now, and it's kind of like, in a lot of ways, once you get out of that circle, you're irrelevant.
Yeah.
Irrelevant. It's kind of like if I see someone that comes into my office and has a degree from, I'd say, the bottom half of the Ivy League institutions, it's not going to carry any more weight with me than any other school for all intents and purposes. Be like, why are you here? Your connections are up in the Northeast. Why are you here? And then also, some of the top schools, it's going to take a while for Harvard to really dim, or Yale, Princeton.
Yeah, the name's still,
the names
Harvard
are
is still the biggest name in education.
At least in the United States. And Princeton, I'd say, and Penn, I was partial to Penn for whatever reason. It's going to take a while. However, universities come and go in terms of prestige, and just because they're at the top now doesn't mean that they're always going to be at the top. You might find it hard to believe that when I was a kid, the very definition of automobile luxury was Cadillac. When you said something was the Cadillac of something, that meant that it was the very best. You couldn't aspire for anything more. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case any longer.
Or at least the perception.
Yeah, the perception. I wouldn't say that's the case any longer. And the same thing can happen with universities as well. And when you have your university presidents up there, not only denouncing, people screaming about the murder of Israelis, but waffling and being so corporate in a lot of ways. And it just was a very bad visual, very bad visual. And then to kind of like, here we are this week with, from what I understand, maybe not so peaceful protests, not only at Columbia, but then also at Yale. And you're kind of like, well, what are these people doing? I mean, shouldn't you be studying? And then, and then not only that, but the schools themselves not doing anything about it.
Right.
I mean, I read that the new NYPD has to be invited onto Columbia campus in order to quell riots, and the university president there waffled for days before doing this. I mean, what in the world's going on? It's a very bad visual for these schools.
And I wonder what this means. It's a bad look. I mean,
it's a bad look.
It's a bad look. But then, when or at what level does that start to translate into? Because it has to be this process of, okay, it's a bad look. Maybe schools or maybe jobs now start being less partial to those schools, or caring less if you're from those schools, and then it's this slow process for anything to actually change in terms of that perception. It was like you mentioned with Cadillac, that wasn't an overnight thing. It takes this process and missteps possibly to have this change in perception. And, anecdotally, I won't mention the names of the companies, but I have friends that went and worked for companies out of Auburn, out of Georgia, that previously only were accepting people from Ivy League schools, some even as focused on an individual one. Some companies only wanted Harvard graduates. And that slow process of changing, okay, maybe there is some really good students that are really hardworking out of a state school, out of Auburn, out of Georgia, Alabama, what have you. That process and that kind of opening of the floodgates to actually saying, hey, let's go find the best talent we can, and being less focused on the school they went to. That's when the wheels kind of start to turn and that snowball starts to grow.
Well, I think what that does here is actually expand the pie a lot for a lot of people from not necessarily Northeastern schools. I will tell you this: anyone graduating from Harvard still has a very extensive network of people from which to apply and get a job and what have you. It's going to take a very long time for these networks to break down. It's when these students go outside of the network. That's where I think they're going to find maybe some shock, just how little people throughout the remainder of the country really sort of value that Ivy League education, or don't value, as the case may be, and just kind of don't care. Well, why are you here? Your networks in the Northeast are in a very small circle of people, and that's not to necessarily badger anyone or what have you. It's just when I take a look around at the people that I know in my life, and know a number of Ivy League graduates, having worked in Maryland for a long period of time and in business over 30 years, I tell you, some of the sharpest minds I know in the world didn't go to Ivy League schools. I mean, actually, in some cases, didn't even go to college at all.
Yeah, and it's really those schools, and even including the Stanfords of the world, have been the only schools to kind of break that trend. I think that's almost more normal than not. If someone goes to, I don't know, University of Washington, Syracuse, something that's not in our area, it kind of doesn't mean a lot.
Yeah.
It's no different. It's just not the schools we know, and you just kind of leave it at that. The Ivy Leagues are the only ones that have really been able to break that trend, and I'm wondering if now it's just starting to put them back into that same kind of level playing field of, if it's not in the area, it's just kind of just another school. And I'm not saying they're just another school right now, but as soon as, like I mentioned, anecdotally, if some companies are now no longer saying we're only going to hire Harvard grads, that's starting to put them on more of an equal playing field.
Well, let me ask you this, and this is going to be a generational thing. I'm 55. Gen X, you're not. You're Gen Z. And I've grown up for my entire life. And the thing is, what I've noticed is, as I get older, a lot of things that seemed to me to be very important when I was younger just no longer mean as much. Things like brands, things like formalities. I mean, I hate to say it, I hate wearing a tuxedo. I used to think it was pretty cool when I was a kid. Your age and younger. I mean, really, I thought it was cool. I'm sorry to call you a kid. You're getting ready to be a dad. But, a lot of things have changed. I think not only just for me, but for society as a whole. So when I'm thinking about, I didn't even bother applying to Harvard. I didn't bother applying to Yale. I didn't think I'd get in. I was a Southerner, and scores were fine. But let's focus on what those places where I can get in. I got everywhere I applied. I ended up going to Wake, and it was fine. I will tell you, though, that as I've gotten older and as I've gotten to know more people in the business community, and as I've gotten more familiar with what I believe the product is coming out of the Northeast a little bit more, it's just it doesn't mean as much to me.
No.
I'm not as impressed. And again, I don't know if it's just familiarity breeds contempt or, the passage of time or what have you. But for me, a lot of this prestige stuff doesn't matter to me. I don't care. I don't care. I mean, it's a University of Washington, as you mentioned, it's a great school. Don't care.
Yeah.
Stanford, don't care. I didn't.
I might get oh wow, that's
yeah. I know the kids.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, that's a good school, but I didn't go there. My kids didn't go there. My wife didn't go there, and you still have to interview with me, and you're not going to get the job sight unseen. And I know there are a lot of quality students coming out of Auburn, Bama, and other Southeastern schools. So for me, as a Gen X, it's been sort of a slow erosion over time. I think 1, location, 2, passage of time, and 3, just general kind of nonsense coming out of the Northeast. And I keep on saying Northeast. I'm not, by association, a lot of other schools being thrown in there and really focusing primarily on Ivy League schools. So for me now, Ivy League, I go fine. But that's me, Gen X. You're not as old as I am. How does your generation feel about
I think you got to go back to what I was talking about, where there's already these trends happening when these events that we're talking about really over the last 6 months have occurred. One has been highly publicized, being the increased cost of education.
Yes.
That's already creating a pushback on higher education as a whole.
Yes.
And I think it's starting to level the playing field with schools that you can get into cheaper or free, in-state, what have you. And then the second one, and we've talked about this, it's been probably a while at this point, but the increasing need for trade schools and people, I think we're starting to...
the people going to trade school weren't going to Harvard.
I understand that. But I think that as a whole, I think people are, instead of just focusing on getting into the best and most expensive and best named school you could get into, I think just opening the doors to some people going to trade school, I think it's shifting everybody maybe down that ladder a little bit in terms of where the demand is, if that makes sense.
Well, I think you're right. But, going back, do you view the Ivy League schools as prestigious, that as maybe their reputation would suggest that you do?
I would say so, but I'd view it almost more as probably 5 schools, and not all of them are even Ivy League schools. I would throw Stanford and Duke in there as well.
Duke? Why are you giving me Duke?
Stanford, Duke, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton.
I would throw Chicago and MIT on there as well.
Yeah.
And so when I take a look at those, maybe
I think Chicago for sure, but I think
Duke, I can't get there. But but everyone else can get there. I just can't get there.
Fair enough.
But
MIT and Chicago.
And then I think some of the directional schools. Some of the schools out in California, Caltech, maybe Berkeley, don't like the politics. Great universities, what have you.
100%. I think there's tons of ones included in that tier that are fantastic universities.
Which is perhaps the reason why places like the Times and elsewhere are ranking maybe some of the other members of the Ivy League well out of the top 10. As I mentioned, Dartmouth is down there below Georgia Tech, and
Georgia Tech was going to be my next example.
And then down there with Boston, and Brown's in there with Boston University, Boston College type schools. That's where the market's saying.
If I'm in state in Georgia and I can get into Georgia Tech or go to an MIT,
you're going to be working so hard. They work those kids to death over there.
But why would I not go for free to Georgia Tech?
Well, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
So because they have the lottery over there,
they
right?
do have a state. They do have a lottery.
So what I'm hearing you say is, these schools, Ivy Leagues, some of the schools in the Ivy League are prestigious, but it's not necessarily the Ivy League. Mm-hmm. Sitting there thinking, it's not to keep on picking on Brown and Dartmouth, but maybe even Cornell and Columbia. So we're sort of the bottom 4 of, I would say, in a lot of people's perceptions. But it's a whole listing of schools, and so it's not just the Ivy League any longer. It's we've got a few good schools in the Ivy League, but there was also these schools here, these schools here, these schools there, and I wonder if over time enough people in your generation and the generation that comes after, I guess that's double A, triple A, I mean, I don't know what it is, and I wonder how they will feel about the Ivy League schools, particularly when you take a look at all these protests, because for a lot of people these protests are very head scratching.
I just think those broader trends are going to continue, and this is just kind of expedited things a little bit. Kind of like we talked about with COVID, there was a lot of trends already happening. COVID kind of maybe expedited them a little. So I don't think we're going to reverse course, and prestigious schools are going to frankly become much more prestigious. They could get back on track a little bit, but this trend of devaluing prestigious educations, I think, is going to continue.
It's gonna have to come from somewhere, and you've seen money tends to talk, and everything else seems to walk. And when the donors stop giving to the school, that's when change happens.
Yep.
And so
seen that.
If you don't like what you're seeing on your campus, and you want the school in the Northeast, quit giving money to it. And that's how you affect change.
I agree.
All right. Well, guys, we always love to hear from you. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. Also, if you're interested in reading more, hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, you can go to oakworth.com, OAKWORTH.com. Take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab and find links to all kinds of exciting information, including previous Trading Perspectives podcasts, links to our blog/newsletter Common Sense, and hopefully soon it'll be out there, the most recent quarterly macro and market analysis magazine, whatever we want to call it here. All right, with that being said, Sam, you got anything else to say on this topic?
That's all I got.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.